Some kinds of tiredness are easy to explain. You can trace them back to a late night, a crowded week, a body that was asked to keep going longer than it wanted to. That kind of exhaustion feels logical. It has a cause you can point to and a solution you can imagine. Rest will help. Time will smooth it out. The system still makes sense. But there is another kind of tiredness that doesn't arrive that way. It doesn't come after chaos. It doesn't announce itself after a collapse. It appears quietly, often in periods that look stable from the outside. You are still doing what you've always done. Still trying. Still moving forward. And yet, somewhere along the way, the effort begins to feel heavier than it used to. Nothing dramatic has happened. There was no clear failure. No obvious overload. That's what makes it unsettling. Effort is supposed to lead somewhere. It's meant to build momentum, or clarity, or at least a sense that what you're doing is worth the energy it costs. So when trying starts to drain instead of strengthen, the mind becomes confused. It starts looking for an explanation. At first, that explanation often turns inward. Maybe I'm weaker than I thought. Maybe I've lost discipline. Maybe this is what happens when motivation runs out. These thoughts don't usually feel loud or cruel. They feel reasonable. Almost responsible. A quiet assumption that if something feels this heavy, it must be because something inside you is failing to keep up. What's rarely noticed is that this experience follows a pattern. It tends to appear after long periods of sustained effort, especially effort that once felt meaningful. When trying had a clear reason. When progress felt possible. When energy and purpose seem to move in the same direction. The exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much in a single moment. It comes from carrying effort for a long time without a sense of arrival. You don't need to be told to keep pushing. You absorb the message naturally. Over time, this creates a strange internal loop. You continue because stopping feels irresponsible. You maintain discipline because losing it feels like losing yourself. Even when the effort no longer feels meaningful, you keep it alive out of habit and fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of being judged. Fear of discovering that without constant effort, you might not know who you are anymore. This is where persistence quietly turns into pressure. You are no longer just doing things. You are monitoring yourself while doing them. Measuring your output. Questioning your motivation. Watching for signs that you are still on track. The mind becomes busy not with the task itself, but with what the task says about you. And the more this internal monitoring grows, the more drained you feel. Not because the work is harder, but because every action is layered with evaluation. You are working, but also judging the work. You are resting, but also questioning whether the rest is deserved. You are continuing, but without a clear sense of why. What makes this especially painful is that it often happens in silence. From the outside, nothing looks broken. You are functioning. You are reliable. You are doing what is expected. And because there is no obvious crisis, the tiredness feels illegitimate. It feels like something you shouldn't complain about. So instead of questioning the system that shaped this pressure, the blame turns inward. You assume the problem must be personal. That you've become lazy. That you've lost motivation. That something essential in you has worn out. The idea that persistence itself might have become distorted rarely gets considered, but this struggle is not a private failure. It is a shared condition. One created by a world that quietly equates constant effort with value, and leaves little room for effort that pauses, softens, or changes direction. When persistence becomes an identity rather than an action, it stops being sustainable. The exhaustion that follows is not a sign that you are weak. It is often a sign that you have been carrying pressure disguised as purpose. And seeing that difference, even faintly, is often the first moment the struggle begins to make sense. There is a way of looking at this exhaustion that does not begin with motivation or diagnosis, but with a simple question: what exactly is your effort trying to control? Not in theory, but in practice. Not what you tell yourself, but what your energy is actually being spent on. A Stoic lens approaches tiredness like this without drama. It does not ask whether you are strong or weak, disciplined or unfocused. It asks where the strain is coming from. More specifically, it asks whether effort has quietly taken on responsibilities it was never meant to carry. In this view, effort itself is not the problem. Action is neutral. Moving, working, responding, continuing, these are ordinary parts of being alive. The trouble begins when effort becomes a tool for securing outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. Not just external results, but internal states. Certainty. Calm. A stable sense of self. The feeling that things finally make sense. When effort is tied to these outcomes, it becomes heavier with every repetition. Each action starts to carry an unspoken expectation. That this time, it will resolve the unease. That this time, it will justify the struggle. That this time, it will deliver a feeling of arrival. And when it doesn't, the disappointment does not disappear. It stays in the body as quiet tension. This is how expectations begin to hijack energy. Not loudly, not consciously, but steadily. You are no longer just doing what is in front of you. You are negotiating with the future. Hoping that effort will protect you from uncertainty, from regret, from the feeling of having wasted time. The mind keeps asking effort to answer questions it cannot answer. From a Stoic perspective, this is unnecessary strain. Not because expectations are wrong, but because they are misaligned. Life, moment to moment, usually asks for very little. Attention. A response. A willingness to engage with what is actually happening. But the mind rarely stays there. It moves ahead, imagining how this moment should feel once it is complete, once it is successful, once it proves something. The more effort is pulled into that imagined future, the less energy remains in the present. Action starts to feel hollow, because it is no longer rooted in what is real. It is tethered to what is hoped for. And hope, when it becomes a demand, is exhausting. This reframing changes the shape of the problem. The issue is no longer that you cannot keep going. It is that you have been carrying more than life required. More meaning. More expectation. More responsibility for outcomes that were never fully under your control. Seen this way, exhaustion becomes less personal. It is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of misallocated energy. Of effort stretched beyond its natural limits. And this realization does not bring instant relief. It brings perspective. A softening of the inner narrative. You begin to notice that much of your tiredness does not come from what you do, but from what you ask you're doing to accomplish. And when that is seen clearly, effort can start to return to its proper size. Not as a solution, but as a quieter, more sustainable way of moving through life. There is a point where it becomes useful to separate effort from the meaning that has been quietly attached to it. At first, this distinction feels subtle, almost unnecessary. Effort looks like effort. Action looks like action. But over time, something else gets woven into it. Expectations settle in. Hopes accumulate. Unspoken contracts form between what you do and what you believe it should give back. This is where much of the exhaustion actually lives. Not in the action itself, but in what the action is being asked to deliver. Effort is no longer just movement. It becomes a promise. A promise that if you keep going, something inside you will finally feel settled. That clarity will arrive. That peace will follow. That the weight you're carrying will be justified by a future moment of relief. These expectations rarely feel dramatic. They don't announce themselves as demands. They feel reasonable. Almost responsible. Of course effort should lead somewhere. Of course trying should mean something. And yet, when effort is tied to these internal outcomes, it becomes heavier each time it's repeated. Every action carries an extra layer. Not just the task, but the hope that the task will resolve something deeper. This is why the same effort can feel light at one stage of life and unbearable at another. The action hasn't changed. What has changed is what you're asking it to hold. When effort is carrying the weight of identity, of self-worth, of the need for reassurance, it stops being sustainable. It is no longer allowed to be imperfect or limited. It has to prove something. Over time, this creates a quiet strain. You begin to feel tired not because you are doing too much, but because every action is loaded with significance. Working isn't just working. It's a statement about who you are. Resting isn't just resting. It's a test of whether you've earned it. Continuing isn't just continuing. It's a way of avoiding the fear that stopping might reveal something uncomfortable. Seen this way, exhaustion becomes more understandable. It is not a failure of energy, but a saturation of meaning. Effort has been stretched beyond its natural role. It has been asked to deliver answers to questions it cannot answer. Questions about value. About purpose. About whether your life is on the right path. When this is noticed clearly, something small but important begins to loosen. Not the effort itself, but the emotional contract attached to it. Effort no longer needs to guarantee peace. It no longer needs to justify existence. It can return to being what it always was, a limited, imperfect response to the moment in front of you. This does not remove tiredness. It changes its texture. Effort may still feel demanding, but it no longer feels like a verdict. It no longer carries the constant pressure to resolve everything at once. There is space for action without constant evaluation. For movement without the demand that it must lead to certainty. Nothing is fixed here. No conclusion is reached. But the grip softens. And sometimes, that is enough. When effort is no longer asked to carry the full weight of meaning, it becomes lighter, not because life is easier, but because the burden it was never meant to hold has been gently set down. There is a quiet moment that sometimes arrives after all the analysis fades, when nothing more needs to be explained. Not because everything has been resolved, but because the pressure to resolve it has softened. This is not a breakthrough. It is not relief. It is closer to neutrality. A small clearing where effort is allowed to be smaller than identity. In that space, being tired of trying stops looking like a personal verdict. It no longer feels like evidence that something in you has failed or gone missing. It begins to look more like a signal. Not a signal to quit life or withdraw from it, but a signal to stop turning every moment into a test of character. To stop asking effort to constantly justify who you are. When effort shrinks back to its proper size, something subtle changes. Actions are no longer required to carry meaning on their own. They do not have to prove worth, or direction, or depth. They are allowed to be incomplete. Ordinary. Sometimes effective, sometimes not. Rest is no longer a reward. It becomes just another state, no more moral than work, no more suspicious than stillness. This does not create motivation. It does not create energy. And that is part of its honesty. The absence of pressure does not suddenly fill the body with enthusiasm or clarity. It simply removes the sense that something is constantly being judged. That quiet judgment, once it loosens, leaves behind a different kind of calm. Not comfort. Not optimism. Just space. In that space, trying can continue without the demand that it leads somewhere meaningful. Or it can pause without the fear that pausing says something final about you. Effort becomes optional again, rather than compulsory. It returns to being an action rather than an identity. This is not resignation. It is not giving up on care or intention. It is stepping out of a role that was never sustainable to begin with. The role of being someone who must always be improving, always be progressing, always be becoming. When that role loosens, life feels less like a performance and more like a series of moments that do not require interpretation. There is no instruction here, because instruction would reintroduce pressure. No conclusion, because conclusions imply arrival. What remains instead is permission. Permission to exist without constantly measuring the value of that existence. Permission to be tired without explaining it away. Permission to let effort be imperfect, limited, and human. This kind of ending does not feel satisfying in the usual sense. It does not wrap things up neatly. It leaves questions open. But that openness is part of its function. It allows the viewer to sit with the experience rather than rush past it. Sometimes the most honest resolution is not a solution, but the absence of one. A quiet understanding that nothing is required in this moment. That you do not need to prove anything by continuing, or by stopping. That being tired of trying is not a failure to be corrected, but a moment to be lived through. Not everything needs to be fixed. Some things need to be allowed to pass.